Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a weekly 30-minute radio show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Today, I'll be doing another solo show. It'll be part 3 of a 4-part series focusing on the book Less is More by Jason Hickel. I cannot recommend this book more. If you're driving around today and you don't catch all of today's show, you can watch today's show and all of our past shows by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and hovering over the Actions and Events menu, and then clicking on Retake Conversations, and you'll see them all listed in chronological order, including the 3 shows that we've spent on Less is More. As is our practice, I want to acknowledge that we are conducting this radio show on stolen Tewa land, and I want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land and being such good role models as to how we as a people, as a humankind, need to learn from them and adopt many of their practices. And that's something that actually Jason Hickel talks a great deal about. I also want to remind our listeners that Retake is creating a 501c3, Rethink Our Democracy. And our intent in forming this is to use its 501c3 status. We have several foundations who are interested in funding us. And in doing so, we can hire staff, a couple of people, and to allow for a transition when Roxanne and I decide that, we can't sustain the level of effort necessary to keep this ball afloat. And that's with that added staff, we will be able to do a great deal more at the interim sessions with the legislature and with the education program that we're launching. So if you want to find out more about Rethink, you can go to retakeourdemocracy.org, and you'll look in the menu bar there and you'll see Rethink. Click on it and you can get to a whole series of documents listed there. One is our goals and vision and scope of work. And another is what we're reading and listening to and watching to inform the development of our approach. And then there's also a link to a description of the roles and responsibilities that volunteers can play. And we need volunteers to help us with this work. And we have what we call huddles every other week for those people who are involved. And our next one is on June 8th. And that one is not going to be focused on what people can do and so forth. It's going to be a discussion entirely devoted to Less is More. So listen to this show, sign up. You can get the link to sign up on the Rethink page, and join us for the discussion. It's going to be a rich one. We are also, well, I guess that's about as much as I need to share today. We've got a lot to talk about. So we're going to get started on Less is More. And, in part 1, I shared Hickel's views on how capitalism evolved, not out of feudalism with serfs choosing to work in manufacturing as a means of escaping a feudalist system, but rather after having enjoyed 150 years of what was called the golden age of the proletarian from 1350 to 1500. That was the evolution out of feudalism. But royalty and a growing merchant class with the advent of a lot of technology determined that in order for them to grow, they had to recapture the land that the serfs had created commons on. The serfs had their own commons, they shared food, they grew it together, they had a sustainable life and the best income that they'd had in their in all of mankind. This was called enclosure. It was basically land theft, much like what was happening at about the same time in the Western Hemisphere with colonization. And in stealing this land, they were able to generate the needed capital to invest in growth. And the other thing they needed, though, were desperate people who would work for any wage. And that was accomplished by kicking these people off of the land. And of course, with slavery in the West. In part two, we covered how economic growth has become the absolute standard for economic health and human well-being. We also described how growth is coupled inextricably with energy use and with emissions and so forth. And so, and then finally, we outlined how, over half of all consumption and emissions are generated by the top 10%. And the lower 50, 60% generate almost no emissions, certainly well below what is sustainable. Going along with that, Hickel talked a good deal about how the global north benefits from all of these emissions and growth to a degree that virtually none of that benefits the global south. And compounding that injustice, 82% of all the costs of climate catastrophes are incurred by the global south. And so we've got a situation that is horrendously unjust and unsustainable. And so today we're going to talk a little bit more, a little bit about some of the, what's the term? Some of the ideas and strategies that have been put forward as means to address climate change without necessarily having to lower our growth, our economic growth. And what Hickel does in one instance after another is to articulate that this is fantasy, and he is able to very clearly use research to debunk. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to start off on page 121. I'm just going to read some passages. In recent years, ecologists have developed a new, more scientifically robust way of thinking about limits. In 2009, a team led by Johan Rockström at the Stockholm Resilience Center, the US climatologist James Hansen and Paul Crutzen, the man who coined the term Anthropocene, published a groundbreaking paper describing a new concept they refer to as planetary boundaries. The Earth's biosphere is an integrated system that can withstand significant pressures, but past a certain point, it breaks down. And drawing on data from the Earth system science, they identified 9 potentially destabilizing processes that we have to keep under control if the system is to remain intact. Climate change is but one of them. Another is biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, land use change, nitrogen and phosphorus loading, freshwater use, atmospheric aerosol loading, chemical pollution, and ozone depletion. And so, with all of those things must be addressed simultaneously, or we can face ecological collapse. He goes on to talk about, it seems, basically one of his major premises is that we have to completely change our economic system and our approach to growth. We can't continue to grow on a finite planet or a planet with finite resources. And he says this is a mind-numbing change for mankind. It's just not something, they have resisted this at every turn. But he rather than being pessimistic about it, he talks about how Charles Darwin in the 1850s, I believe it was, introduced, the concept of Darwinism, basically, and evolution. And that smacked in, that just was counter to all of religious thinking in terms of how we began as a species and our relationship to the earth. And people resisted it like crazy until it was proven. And then all of a sudden it changed and it became the dominant dogma. So I guess his point there is that it's not impossible for us to make a move forward and a change that he describes as being necessary. And one of the things he says that the failure to come to grips with the kind of change that is required and to continue to go forward with growth in an unsustainable way, he says it's like jumping off of a cliff while hoping that someone at the bottom will figure out how to build some kind of device to catch you before you crash into the rocks below, without having any idea as to whether they'll actually be able to pull it off. It might work, but it might not. It's game over if they don't. Once you jump, you can't change your mind. And he correlates that analogy with pretty much the way we're operating as a society. We're assuming that we can make things work and keep temperature under 1.5 degrees centigrade gain by doing a whole raft of things. And as he points out, one after the other is akin to jumping off a cliff and hoping something works. He begins by talking about carbon capture. And he says that the idea was that you can get by with making relatively minor reductions in CO2 emissions, nothing that would pose any significant threat to economic growth, so long as we manage to get carbon capture up and running. We'll overshoot the carbon budget, but that's okay because, and it's called BECCS, carbon capture concept. We'll pull the excess carbon back out of the atmosphere later in the century, bringing us back into the safety zone. Emit now, clean up later, jump off a cliff and hope it works. But he then goes on to point out the problem with this, and it's not a small problem. And the biggest problem is that even the people who advance the idea of carbon capture acknowledge that it is something that is designed to be operated on a very small scale. Unfortunately, in all of the projections that are being used as to how to get under 1.5 degrees centigrade, keep our warming to that, depend upon a complete rollout of this carbon capture, a massive rollout, so large that it's way beyond what was ever envisioned. And yet we have this in our calculations and we're depending on it to actually be able to work in the way that a full rollout would achieve. And so he goes on to say modelers have misused the idea of carbon capture, he says, by including an irregular scenario for staying under 1.5 degrees. Afraid of calling for steeper emission cuts, policymakers have been using BECCS as an excuse to carry on with the status quo. Some of the other key figures behind early articulations of BECCS have also raised questions, pointing out that the technology was only ever meant to be used on a small scale. They warned from the beginning that large-scale rollout would be a social and ecological disaster, and yet modelers have run with it anyway. He goes on to say that, let's see where we, okay. It was difficult to find an outlet that didn't carry the head. Oh, okay, I got it. The IPCC then has been paying attention to these critiques. In October of 2018, it released a special report outlining what it will take for us to keep under 1.5 if we accept that we cannot reasonably rely on negative emissions or carbon capture technologies. The report landed like a bombshell in the world's media. It was difficult to find an outlet that didn't carry the headline findings. If we want to have a decent shot at maintaining temperatures under 1.5 centigrade, we have to cut global emissions in half by 2030 and get to zero by 2050. It's impossible, he states, to overstate how dramatic this trajectory is. It means nothing less than the rapid and dramatic reversal of our present direction as a civilization. We have built up global fossil fuel infrastructure over the past 250 years, and now we have to change in a matter of decades. And remember what he said about Darwin. So it's not as if we can't do this. It's that we choose not to do this. And so if you choose not to do something, you can also choose to do it. He goes on to say that the conclusion shared by widely among scientists, including at the very high levels, even the PCC now, IPCC itself acknowledges that without BECCS or carbon capture and other speculative technologies, there's no feasible way to roll out clean energy fast enough to get to zero emissions by 2050. As long as the energy demand keeps growing, that we can't do that. Energy demand has to shrink. If we want to succeed, we have to do exactly the opposite we have done to scale that, and we have to scale down energy use. And he goes on, I mean, it's pretty dramatic. He goes, I'm not going to read all the numbers, but he goes through what it would take for us in order to get to 2050, 100% renewable energy powering the planet. He calculates, or he doesn't calculate, he relies on scientists who have done these calculations, how much minerals would be required to generate the solar and wind power, to store it, and to build the necessary number of vehicles, electric vehicles, so that we have 100% electric vehicles. And it's just not even remotely possible. There's just not enough minerals in the world to do this. And so it's almost like, well, wait, does that mean we can't succeed? We're cooked. And what he goes on to say is that no, it doesn't mean that. What it means is that we have to shrink. We cannot continue to grow at the pace that we are currently growing. And so we're going to take just a quick, well, no, let's just read this real quick. It's important to keep in mind that most of the key materials for the energy transition are located in the global south. Parts of Latin America, Africa, and Asia are likely to become a target of a new scramble for resources if we don't change the way we operate. And some countries may become victims of a new form of colonization. It happened in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries with the hunt for gold and silver from South America. In the 19th century, it was land for cotton and sugar plantations in the Caribbean. In the 20th century, it was diamonds from South Africa and cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and oil from the Middle East. It is not difficult to imagine that the scramble for renewables might become similarly violent. And so that's not, we can't go down that path. We can't continue to exploit the global south, and we can't take all the minerals in the world out of the world, and then, and then what? So before we go on with more, I just want to remind you that this is the last day of KSFR's pledge week, pledge month. They've gone through the whole month of May. And so this is your last chance to contribute, and I really want you to do so. If you can just go to ksfr.org, click on the donate button and give them 10, 20, 50, 100 bucks. And think of it as your ticket for admission to shows like this, and just a vast array of programming that's just phenomenal. They cannot survive without your support. So let's see if we can't help them out. And you can also call right now by calling 505-510-5737 and just leaving a message, because they won't be there on Saturday, leaving them a message and telling them that you'd like to contribute and leaving your phone number, email address, and they'll get back to you. So we hear now that growth has to be curtailed, that there's not enough minerals in the world to create the storage, the energy generation, and the cars that are required to get to 2050 with 100% renewables. And so then he goes on to say that he just starts taking a look at one strategy after another that has been put forward. And so here's one. It's talking about geoengineering, and it's just like, figuring out ways to create a dome over the earth so that it shields it from the sun. There are a number of these ways to tinker with the ozone and so forth. And none of them have been proven to be viable, but nonetheless, people are looking to that. And he points out something pretty germane. He goes, it's worth pausing to reflect on the growing fascination with geoengineering. What's interesting about it is that it embodies the very same logic that got us into trouble in the first place. The idea that the living planet, rendered as mere nature, is nothing but a set of passive materials that can be subdued, conquered, and controlled. Geoengineering represents dualism taken to an astonishing new degrees. The fatal flaw of geoengineering is that it seeks to solve the ecological crisis with the very same thinking, the very same hubris that created it in the first place. But perhaps more immediately, the problem with geoengineering is that it is ecologically incoherent. Solar radiation management is only a partial response to the crisis we face. It would do nothing to slow the pace of ocean acidification or deforestation or soil depletion or mass extinction. And this brings us to the next point. And so then he goes on to another strategy that has been put forward. And that is basically, he goes on to say, we tend to think of capitalism as a system that incentivizes innovation. So the next thing that people have put out there is, we'll figure something out. And again, think back to the metaphor of jumping off a cliff and hoping somebody figures something out. But here it's in relation to innovation and technology, and we'll come up with something. We tend to think of capitalism as a system that incentivizes innovation, and it does. But paradoxically, the potential ecological benefits of innovation are constrained by the logic of capital itself. It doesn't have to be this way. If we lived in a different kind of economy, an economy organized around, organized around growth, our technological innovations would have an opportunity to work as we expect them to. In post-growth economy, efficiency improvements would actually reduce our impact on the planet. And once we are liberated from the growth imperative, we will be free to focus on different kinds of innovations. Innovations designed to improve human and ecological welfare, rather than innovations designed to speed up the rate of extraction and production. And he gives us an example, a chainsaw. He says that the chainsaw was invented and it allowed people to cut down trees 10 times as quickly. Well, with the advent of the chainsaw, it's not as if workers then got to work 1/10 as long and go home and they just cut down the same amount of trees. They cut down 10 times as many trees. And that analogy applies to almost every form of innovation. And he goes over quite a number of those examples of how technology, could conceivably reduce the amount of work we do and the amount of things we consume, but the reverse occurs. So the next thing he talks about is green growth. And for the same basic reasons as he has debunked innovations, he shreds the concept of green growth, because any kind of growth results in the consumption of a finite number of resources. But beyond that, capitalism really depends upon the consumption of something, some exploitation either of humans or resources that the capitalist secures at a discount or for free. And so those costs are externalized, and it allows the capitalist to make profit. And in a green economy, that would be the same dynamic. And he points out that if it's done if green growth is done in such a way that you cannot exploit the natural resources any longer, then the problem will be that they will then go and try and exploit the humans the workers, and it'll probably be in the global south. And there's abundant evidence that that's something that um, is something we have a history of doing. He goes on to then say, what is striking about all this is that people are willing to go to extraordinary lengths to justify the continued pursuit of economic growth, instead of simply realizing that we can have to invent this other way of existing. And I wish we had more time. We're only going to be able to get a little further into this, but and then we'll finish up next week. But one of the things that he points out is that it's eminently doable. And he points to the global south, where there are abundant countries that consume far less than what is necessary to stay under to prevent 1.5 centigrade. And yet they have a far higher, they have longer lives than we do. They have far greater welfare, human welfare and happiness. And in most of these instances, in most of these countries, they've invested heavily in education and healthcare and early childhood. And these are not wealthy countries. They're talking about Sri Lanka, they're talking about Costa Rica, and he gives example after example of how these countries are able to deliver to their communities, to their citizens, a very high quality of life. And because so many of these things don't cost so much money, for example, he points out the cost of what has happened to the cost of education in the United States. It now can cost up to $250,000 to put a kid through college. You got 3 kids, that's $750,000. And healthcare costs are just exorbitant, with premiums and co-pays and pharmaceuticals. And in these countries, they don't cost anything. And because of that, people don't have to earn as much. They don't have to work as hard. And it's really quite simple math. It's like, if you take those costs out of the equation, all of a sudden you don't need as much money to sustain yourself. And so one of the things, we're going to have to come to a close here pretty quickly. But I did want to mention that there are one of the things that is driving the consumption of, or are almost certainly passing 1.5 centigrade, is that rich people, and this is a quote, rich people have a much higher ecological footprint than everybody else. The richest 10% of the world's population are responsible for almost half of the world's total lifestyle carbon emissions. In other words, the global climate crisis is being driven largely by the global rich. And things become even more lopsided as we climb the economic ladder. The richest 1% emit 30 times more than the poorest 50% of human population. 30 times what 50% of the world consumes. Why? It's not only because they consume more stuff than everybody else, but also because the stuff they consume is more energy intensive. Huge houses, big cars, private jets, frequent flights, long distance holidays, luxury imports, and so on. And if the rich have more money than they can spend, which is virtually always the case, then they invest their excess in expansionary industries that are quite often ecologically destructive. So that's where we're going to end for today. It's not a very uplifting place to end, but what I want to offer you is the knowledge that in part 4, we're going to hear just how easy it is for us to make the shift we have to make to create a sustainable planet for ourselves and for our grandkids. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week at 8:30. And again, you can get this recording at KSFR. No, you can't. You can get it at retakeourdemocracy.org. Go to the Actions and Events page, click on Retake Conversations, and by 8:30 or 9 in the morning on Saturday, you'll now have all 3 of the Less is More broadcasts to examine. And then we'll get back to you next Saturday to finish up. Thank you very much for being with us. Bye-bye.